So good to see you. How have you been?
Great. How are you doing, Reggie?
Wonderful. How's your family doing?
They're all doing great. They're doing wonderful. Yeah, yeah. I don't know why you're not clear. You look very fuzzy. And I'm wondering if
Sure.
oh, now you look good. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I wasn't sure if that was a screen or something. How's your family doing? How's everything going?
Everyone's doing really well. My daughter is getting married next month.
Oh, how wonderful.
Hmm.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So
Yeah,
it's been great. We're all doing really well.
yeah, yeah. How many kids do you have?
Just the one.
Okay, okay.
Just the one.
And where is she getting married?
She lives in Waukesha. She and her fiance, to my wife's consternation, they're not having a traditional wedding because of COVID.
Yeah.
Uh, and so my wife is really struggling with the fact that they haven't picked a specific date. I told my wife, I'm
Mm,
like, listen, this is the younger generation. They don't
yeah.
necessarily think the way we do. So just be happy that she found someone and they've been together for this will be 5 years that they've been
Wow.
together. They're really happy. They purchased a home together back in December, so they're doing really really well.
Wonderful. Well, I think we are in the show. I believe that we started. So just welcome everyone. And as you can see, Reggie and I were just catching up, this practically 1 year of COVID. We haven't really seen each other in person. So we're catching up. And he was just talking about his daughter getting married. So next month. So congratulations. Congratulations to you, Reggie.
Thank you.
Um, we're so thrilled to have you, and I think really you don't need any introduction, but just for those that may by chance have been living under a rock and don't know who you are. Reggie Jackson is really, he is nationally known. He's phenomenal. I've known him for quite a while, and he is currently the co-owner and lead trainer consultant for Nurturing Diversity Partners. He everywhere I go, he is speaking, and he tells those seldom told stories about the experiences of African Americans and other people of color, past and present. He's won so many awards from many different groups and organizations, and he's a protege of his mentor, Dr. James Cameron. Who I still remember. He was a lynching survivor and the founder of America's Black Holocaust Museum. And Reggie has worked with the museum for about 20 years. So tell us a little bit about what's happening now with COVID in the museum, because I know there was just a major undertaking there for a while, and then COVID hit. So what's going on?
Well, the museum has been struggling with COVID like all the rest of us have. They had planned on opening last summer to the public, but obviously that wasn't something safe to do. So they're kind of planning for when it'll be safe, and we'll be able to get people into the space. I'm not actively involved with the museum in the way that I had been for a number of years. Just really kind of more playing a supportive role as a volunteer. But looking forward to the time when people will be able to come into the museum.
That's wonderful. This film, I've seen it quite a number of times, but it's such a powerful film. There's so much really information. There's so many things that I think people are just not aware of. I was just speaking with some individuals, and they were talking about the fact that in their entire K through 12 time in school, they never learned about these types of things. And just I think even just simple things about how advanced African society was, and these slaves that were brought here were not brought as barbaric individuals. These were civilized societies. These were highly advanced and educated and literate societies in comparison to many of the slave owners that owned them. So tell us what you think. Why don't you just go ahead and give us some feedback, what you thought about the film and what you would like to share.
The film is exceptional. It shares some of the history that people just simply don't know, as you said, Janan. People don't know anything about Africa other than the fact that African people were kidnapped and brought to the West, but they don't know where they came from. Part of what Dr. Cameron wanted us to talk about at the museum was to start your journey at the museum with an understanding of who these people were and where they came from, and talk about the gifts that they brought with them. One of the things that I used to tell people as I gave tours at the museum is that if you don't understand, listen, people wanted a labor force, right? Obviously, that's why the Africans were brought here, kind of as a replacement for Native Americans who had died off or been killed off. But they didn't just go get anybody, right? They wanted skilled people. If they were going to be working with, tobacco, rice, sugarcane, they wanted people that had experience with those things. And so they took the best and the brightest that West Africa had. Majority of the people who were transported came from West Africa, some from East Africa as well, but most from West Africa. These are very skilled people, very intelligent people, and they took the youngest folks. They took mostly males, some females, but mostly males. And these people contributed to the world in a way that people just never give them credit. The wealth of the West, of the United States and all of the European nations, is the wealth that was built by these Africans who worked for free for literally 246 years in the United States. But another part of the story is, how did they get here? What was that journey like? And the film does a really good job of exploring, the disconnect between the lives they left behind and the families they left behind, the communities they left behind. I think really people don't think about that. They think about the people leaving Africa, but they don't think about what was left. And so imagine this: you take the best and the brightest, the youngest, the most healthy, the most vibrant members of the community, and you take them out of a community permanently, right? What happens to the rest of the community? What happens to the elders of the community? What happens to the young children who've now lost their fathers and their mothers and their aunts and their uncles, right? It's devastating to Africa, and even after the transatlantic slave trade ended, when Brazil ended slavery in 1888. 4 years before Brazil ended slavery, European nations got together, met in Berlin, Germany, and they had what was known as the Berlin Conference, where they decided they were going to take Africa and carve it up into little pieces and give part to the Portuguese, part to the French, part to the English, part to the Dutch, so on and so forth, part to the Germans. And they divvied up the continent, colonized the continent, and kind of continued the mistreatment of these African people. And really, they've never been able to fully recover from that. A lot of the challenges that Africa has today, particularly, well, actually all parts of Africa for the most part, are because of hundreds of years of colonialism and a disavowal of their history and their culture by these European nations that came and forced them to assimilate into their way of seeing the world. And now you have all of these Africans in the diaspora. People don't know that Africans were transported to Canada, to Mexico, to Jamaica, to Peru, to Colombia, to Brazil. In fact, if you look at the Africans in the West, the largest percentage of Africans taken out of West Africa went to Brazil, and they still have the largest African ancestor population outside of Africa. I think I don't have my Eventive page open. Let me take the headphones off and see if that gets rid of this sound, because I'm hearing it too. Um, let's see. Is that better for you all now, or can you still hear that? Okay. Let me change my settings for the audio to MacBook speakers. And okay. Is that better? Can you hear me better now? Without the echo?
Yeah, see, I'm not having a
Okay.
problem
I
there,
can
but
hear you
I think
now.
they can, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So I don't hear
Yeah,
the
it's
echo,
better.
but I
Yeah,
can hear you speaking, Janan.
yeah, yeah. They're saying
So
it's
I
better,
took the
so it's
headphones
better, yeah.
off.
Yeah.
Have to figure out why I can't hear you though. Let's see. Let me try this. I'm gonna try to turn my speakers up. Can you say something, Janan, so that I can see if I can hear you?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
I still don't hear you.
Mm,
Um, let's see here. I don't know. Um, well, I guess what you're hearing from me is better. I'll maybe have to try to read your lips. But what I was saying is that, so these African people came, the largest percentage, about 40%, went to Brazil. So Brazil to this day has the largest African ancestor population outside of Africa. About 80 million Afro-Brazilians. In fact, if you took all the Afro-Brazilians from Brazil, took them back to Africa, they would become the second largest nation in Africa. And then, surprisingly, people don't know this. Only about 3 to 5% of the Africans transported to the U.S. came to the U.S. About 300,000 or so, according to the estimates by historians. But that 300,000 that were transported here eventually grew to be about 10 million Africans enslaved in the United States over those 246 years. And even when you think of the nation has the third largest African ancestor population, is a country that most people assume that there are no black people in, Colombia. So Brazil was number one, and then U.S. and then Colombia. So it had a huge impact on the West. These African people went all over the West in every nation, and they left, this gigantic hole back in Africa. And it's very unfortunate that people don't know those things, that we don't know that history, that we're not taught that history. It's very unfortunate because I think people would understand African people in this part of the world better. They'd understand more about the fact that, a significant number of these Africans were actually Muslims. Back in West Africa, as they were transported on ships. I never realized it the first time I was a kid, back when the Roots miniseries based on Alex Haley's life story came out on television. I remember watching that, and I didn't know anything about Islam at the time, right? And so the
mhm.
fact that I watched that again years later, and I heard them saying Allah all the time, I'm like, wait a minute. They were actually Muslims. Kunta Kinte was a Muslim. I was like, oh my goodness, I never knew this. And so it just shows that connection, that those of us who are here in the United States, we were disconnected from an understanding that was part of their lived experience, and that was part of their religious tradition in West Africa, throughout the entire region of West Africa.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now I
That's
can't
absolutely,
hear you unless I put the headphones. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the headphones
yeah,
on to
put
hear
it on.
you, and then I'll unplug the headphones to talk.
Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Well, I'll have to go and change my settings real quick.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. That's all right. I think if we can deal with the background noise, that's all right. But as you said, a lot of people are not aware that, West Africa is predominantly Muslim, and that's where many of the slaves did come from. But after coming here and being forced to change their faith, so many of them lost track of their faith. One of the things that I wanted to to just discuss is that, this past year has been really, I think, kind of like they say, a watershed moment finally in American history. Just the whole idea of structural racism, the whole idea of, the effect of long-term effect of slavery on society. People that just, they don't make the connection. What do you feel that, especially with some of the things that are happening and continue to happen, and the effects of structural racism, and how does that go back to the whole history of slavery in this country?
Okay, I'm going to.
I
I don't
think
hear.
you're okay if you just
Okay,
leave your headphones on. I think we're okay.
okay, okay. So, I think it's important for people to understand that you can't understand today without looking at yesterday, right?
Mhm.
And people always say, well, Reggie, it was a long time ago. Why are we still talking about slavery? It ended in 1865. I'm hearing the feedback. So let me unplug these again because it's
Okay.
beginning to irritate me a little bit. And I hate to
Okay.
keep going back and forth, but we'll
Yeah.
make do with this.
Okay.
So let me unplug these. Okay. So yeah. So in order to understand today, you have to go back into the past, right? So this is what I tell people is that first of all, America as a nation was a slave nation much longer than it's been a free nation. So think about this. The timeline of the first Africans arriving here, 1619, August of 1619. Slavery was an official, institution in all of the original 13 colonies as they developed into states. It was a northern institution before it was a southern institution. And so every African person who was brought here, even though historians try to tell you, well, they weren't slaves, these people were indentured servants. Listen, indentured servitude was a system where white people signed a contract before they got on a boat to come to America, where they said, I'll work for free of 47 years to pay my passage. There was nobody on the coast of West Africa with a clipboard asking black people to sign up to go to America to work, right? So we weren't indentured servants. I don't care if we were treated as indentured servants or whatever. We were brought over on slaving ships, right? And so over the course of 246 years, we think that slavery ended in 1865 with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, but it really didn't, because what happens is you don't read the 13th Amendment, you read about it. So if you read the 13th Amendment, it says that slavery and involuntary servitude are illegal except as punishment for a crime you've been duly convicted of. So it's literally still a legal institution. And many people in our prison system today are working, that they're not working completely for free. I mean, they're getting paid 13 cents an hour, 11 cents an hour, whatever. Basically, it's free, right? But what happens is because of that way the 13th Amendment was written, it allows a system called the convict lease system to develop. And what they would do is they would go around and they would charge black people with crimes, right? Made up laws, they call them black codes. Now we're going to convict you in court, and now we're going to sell you to the highest bidder. So if someone has a plantation they want someone to work on for free, or they have a mining company and they need someone to work for free, they're going to arrest these black men and boys. They're going to force them to work. And this system, this convict lease system that some people call slavery by another name, lasted all the way through the early 1940s before it ended. 90% of the people caught up in this system of working for free against their will because they've been convicted of a crime were black men and boys, right? So you have that. So think about slavery not really ending until 1940 instead of 1865, but also thinking about the fact that these 4 million Africans, when slavery ended in 1865, and the reason that it ended in 1865, this is something else that people don't understand. The Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and people need to read that document too. One of the things that was in it that people don't acknowledge is the fact that for the first time in American history, they acknowledged the right of black men to bear arms, right? Freely bear arms. 200,000 black men served in the Union Army and Navy, turned the tide of the war. The war was going horribly for the North at the time. The Union was losing the war. And Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on the day that he did because he needed to get some positive news out there, right? So those 200,000 black men joined the Union Army and Navy, turned the tide of the war. And I can say that I have a personal connection to that because my great grandfathers great grandfather served in the Colors Troop Unit, and helped to turn the tide of the war. So you think about these 4 million people finally being free. And, for from 1865 to 1877, they were allowed to vote. Black men they were given their citizenship rights. All of these amendments to the Constitution, 13, 14, 15, it seemed like things were going to get better, but they didn't. Because what happened, you had a disputed election in 1876. And they decided to give the presidency to Rutherford B. Hayes because he promised to take the last of the troops out of the South who were protecting Black people's rights. And that is the time where everything became very, very ugly. It was ugly already because the Ku Klux Klan had been terrorizing Blacks since the war ended. They were outlawed in 1871, but you had these vigilante groups that were damaging Black communities, killing Black people, raping Black women, all these things, and it really took off even more. You began to see a period of lynchings taking place. 5,000 documented lynchings from 1870s through the 1960s. I always tell people, Janan, that the least known part of African American history is what happened after slavery ended and the time when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Those 90 years of history, that was the ugliest part of our history because we were supposedly citizens, right? We were supposedly in a position where we had all of these rights, but we really weren't able to enjoy those rights. You had all these Black people who were lynched. You had dozens and dozens of anti-Black race riots around the country where white people left their communities, went into Black communities, beat and killed people, looted their homes, looted their businesses, looted their churches. We all are probably familiar with the story of Tulsa, Oklahoma, nearly 100 years ago. In May of this year, to be the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, 35 square blocks of Tulsa's Black section, the Greenwood section of Tulsa, known as Black Wall Street, was destroyed. The largest Black-owned hotel in the country was in Tulsa. But that was just one event. That was in 1921. Go back to 1919, there were 25 major anti-Black race riots around the country, from California, from the East Coast to the West Coast, North and South, in cities all across the country. Anti-Black race riots happened where thousands of Black people were killed, and we don't learn about any of those things. We don't learn about those race riots because people don't call them race riots. They call what happened in Watts, in Newark, New Jersey, and Los Angeles after Rodney King race riots. But I always tell people, listen, a race riot is when you leave your community and you go into the community of the other racial group and you do these horrible things. Black people have never been allowed to leave their communities and go into the white community and do those things. All of the stuff that we've seen in the 60s, over the last couple years, after George Floyd, all these things, you see the things that happen. And people say, well, why are they destroying their own community? Well, you know why they're destroying their own community? Because they can't go to anybody else's community and destroy anything. They're not going to be allowed. I lived in Los Angeles when the Rodney King trial was going on, in the aftermath of that. And one of the things that I tell people is I had a good friend who was a student at UCLA. He could not get back on campus when all of the civil unrest was happening in Los Angeles. He went back, he had his ID, he even had his UCLA jacket on, and a group of residents in Westwood, California had barricaded themselves in front of UCLA with guns, and they wouldn't let him on the campus. He literally had to go to his girlfriend's house and stay there for several days before he was able to get back on campus. So when we think about Jim Crow segregation, a lack of ability for Black people to buy homes, Black people being forced to flee the South in the Great Migration. 6 million Blacks from 1910 to 1970 left the South to go to a place like Milwaukee and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and New York. But guess what? When we got to places like Milwaukee, white people didn't want us to be their neighbors. So they redlined our neighborhoods. They wrote racial restrictive covenants, which wouldn't allow us to live in their neighborhoods. But even more importantly than that, the Federal Housing Administration, realtors, bankers prevented Black people from becoming homeowners. And that's how you build generational wealth. White people had the ability to buy homes, build equity, use that equity to pay for their children's college education, to make repairs on their home, to buy a little cabin up north to vacation at, to buy a boat to go out on the lake. All of those things, live the American dream. We as Black people didn't have that advantage. We had the exact opposite. And then when it came to the GI Bill, all of these Black men served in World War II, came back thinking, okay, I can get free college and I can get a home loan. Sorry, it doesn't happen because they give control over the GI Bill to the states. So my mother's uncles who served in World War II came back thinking that they'd be able to go to college in Mississippi. But where were they going to go to college at? They couldn't go to Ole Miss. They couldn't go to Mississippi State. They couldn't go to University of Alabama, University of Florida, University of Texas. 19 states had separate colleges and universities for blacks. So what happens is these black GIs come back. They can't get the education. 21% of black GIs in 1945 said they wanted to further their education once they went back home. But 2 years after the war, only 4.7% of black GIs have been able to take advantage of the GI Bill education benefit, because the HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities, they didn't have enough. They didn't have enough seats for all of these black GIs. They didn't have enough room on campus for them to stay on campus. And so most of the black GIs couldn't take advantage. But guess what happened? The white GIs come back. They go to technical school, they go to college, they get into middle class and upper middle class positions, and they begin to live the American dream. Now they can buy a home out in the suburbs because they just built a brand new suburb for white people only, right? Build a nice house out there that's going to accrue value over a long period of time. You're going to build this generational wealth, and you're going to be doing really, really well as a white person. But as a black person, sorry, you're left out of all of that. Even Social Security. And unemployment insurance created in 1935. Black people, most of them weren't eligible because they said if you're a farm worker or a domestic worker, you're not eligible for either of those programs. And that was the case until 1952. So you have an entire, 17 or 27 years where black people cannot contribute to Social Security and have that to fall back on when they become elders in the community. And we're constantly fighting a battle to catch up, right? Here in Milwaukee, it's one of the worst places to be as a black person. We have the second lowest black home ownership rate nationally. 44% of blacks own their homes. In Milwaukee, it's only 27%. The only city that's worse is Minneapolis, where it's 25%. So we had a period of time in Milwaukee that was very prosperous for black people, where we came for the manufacturing jobs. That's the only thing that brought us to Milwaukee. Believe me, we didn't come to deal with this polar vortex type of weather, right? There was no reason to leave Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama and that warmth and come to cold Milwaukee. But the jobs were here. They were abundant. But when those jobs went away, we were the last hired and first fired. 92,000 manufacturing jobs were the jobs that brought black people to Milwaukee. 92,000 disappeared from 1963 to 2017. So our experience of doing really well in 1970, when we had the seventh highest median family income for blacks in the country, our poverty rate was 22% below the national average for blacks. It was a grand time to be black in Milwaukee. But when those jobs went away, they were replaced by service sector jobs or no jobs, and we have never recovered from that. But even nationally, when we think about this, I ask people this question all the time. Why was the civil rights movement necessary? Why did we have to have a civil rights movement? When we had 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, we had all of these civil rights acts passed by Congress, supposedly protecting us, but we still weren't respected because laws are only worth the enforcement behind them. And Jim Crow was not just about, these signs that said blacks only, colors only, whites only, whatever. Jim Crow was a mindset that developed that told white people that they were better than black people, that told black people that they were inferior to white people. And we've lived with that. America has grown to know us as people who are inferior to white people. And I don't care who you are living in this country, you're going to get constant, consistent reinforcement of that. Negative images of blacks have been around for 200 years, right? In media, whether it be magazines, television, movies, wherever, the local newspaper, the local news channel, you get constant, consistent reinforcement of black people in a negative way. And we have to fight against that every day. We have to fight against it in two ways. We have to fight against it in here, the internalized racism that develops because some of us begin to believe and internalize those negative beliefs about ourselves. And then we have to constantly prove ourselves to white people in order to get ahead in life, right? And I can remember hearing this when I was a kid. You have to work twice as hard, if not more than that, to get the same things that white people have. And those are the realities of our lived experience. And when you look at all of the things that happened after George Floyd was murdered, and white people all of a sudden are, oh my goodness, the police are treating black people horribly. We've been saying that for a long time, people. You just woke up and realized that because guess what? You didn't believe us before. You thought that we were exaggerating it. You didn't believe us when we said driving while black is a real thing. You didn't believe us when we said that Eric Garner, who was selling loose cigarettes, shouldn't have been choked to death in a viral video, literally a snuff film, literally, and nothing happened to the cops. You didn't believe us when Rodney King was beat nearly to death, and nothing happened to the cops in the criminal court. They were, acquitted, and it took federal civil rights charges for them to be charged. And so our entire existence in America as Black people has been an existence where we're fighting an uphill battle on an unlevel playing field. White people like to believe that they have what they have because of the Protestant work ethic and all this other stuff. That's nonsense. You have what you have because you've been given advantages by systemic racism. Systemic racism is basically a system that is designed to give advantages in this country, advantages to white people and disadvantages to everybody else. That's what systemic racism does. And white people seem to not understand that their lives as a white person, because as I've traveled around the state, white people have said, I was taught to be colorblind, Reggie. See everybody the same. I'm like, listen, colorblindness is nonsense. When Dr. King talked about judging people by the content of their character, he wasn't talking about being colorblind. What he was saying was that understand our experiences are different. We have challenges that you don't have as a white person. Respect that, understand that about us, and now judge us based on knowing where we come from. And so when people say that they're colorblind, I said, listen, the only people that are colorblind are people that are legally, physically colorblind. Nobody else colorblind, right? You shouldn't want to be colorblind, because what you're saying to people of color, what you're saying to Native Americans, what you're saying to Asian Americans, what you're saying to the Latinx community, when you say you're colorblind, you're saying, I don't respect your lived experiences as being different than mine. I don't respect the fact that you have to walk a different walk in society than I do because I'm a white person. That's literally the message that you're sending to people of color when you talk about being colorblind. So I want people to understand that one of the biggest challenges we have is that we don't know American history very well. We teach American history by leaving out all of the ugly stuff. And if you don't understand the ugly stuff, you don't understand how we got to where we are. You don't understand why it's such a challenge for people to talk about race and racism, why some people can't even say those words out loud. We talk about the country is so divided. And I tell people the country isn't divided. The country has always been divided. What's different today is we're no more divided than we've been before. What's different? White people are divided. White people are more divided than they've ever been, and that's the challenge. And so I'm gonna come back so that I can try to hear you again, and plug these in. I don't hear the echo, but I'm gonna plug this in so that I can hear you again. So let me go back. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. You're doing great. No, it's you're always such a wealth of information, and there's, every time I listen to you, I learn something new, and I know we could spend hours talking to you. One of the things that I really, especially with what's going on today and the polarization of the last 4 years in particular, not that there wasn't all this racism before, but it was just, I think it was so mainstreamed, these last 4 years. But how do we kind of now, and I know as an educator, this is something that's close to your heart. How do we go into our schools? How do we teach our children to unlearn this kind of racism that has been so devastating to Black people, but to many different groups and nationalities? I mean, Muslims and Islamophobia now are at the forefront. But of course, the Black community has suffered, I think, more than any other. But how do we go into the schools and try to unteach this and help students to understand how to live together and to work together?
Well, I think we have to start with our young people. Many older people, they're too far gone. They're too fixed in their way of seeing the world. They're too entrenched in their belief system, and you can't convince them otherwise, right? There's a brilliant philosophy that developed by Professor Joe Fagan, a sociologist at Texas A&M University. He calls it the white racial frame. He wrote a book called The White Racial Frame. And what it is a 400-year-old worldview that teaches us to think of white people as superior and everybody else is inferior. To think of, Christians as superior and every other religious belief as inferior, right? So we're all invested in getting that information on a daily basis when we watch television, when we watch movies, when we read the newspaper, when we hear the local news or the national news. We get constant, consistent reinforcement of that. White people get constant, consistent reinforcement of that. And what ends up happening, how do you get that out of people's heads when there's constant reinforcement of it? And we know in the last 4 years, that whispering of these things out loud has become like a bullhorn, right? Those things that people, I say this, for white people who have been racist, right? It got to a point where it was embarrassing to say out loud that you were a racist, but now it's okay. It's okay. We've had someone in the White House for 4 years that says, it's okay to be racist. He'll say things like, "I'm the least racist person in this room." This is what the president said. And I said, listen, the only way you could be the least racist person in the room is if you are the only person in the room, right? That's the only way it's possible, right? So we think about him refusing to acknowledge the wrong of these white supremacists that beat people in Charlottesville. We know that Heather Heyer lost her life when this man drove her car into the crowd and killed her, but we don't know that he injured dozens of other people. People were in the hospital for months after being hit by his car. We don't know that they had spent several days beating people. We don't really know how bad Charlottesville was, and for the president to refuse to acknowledge that by saying there were good people on both sides, I mean, you're sending a very clear message when you say, on a national debate, a presidential debate, you say that you don't know who the Proud Boys are, and you know exactly who they are, and then you tell them, to stand by, stand down and stand by. You're sending a very clear message when you decide to go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, a place where this race massacre happened on Juneteenth Day, the day that Black people, use as a day to celebrate the ending of when the last enslaved Africans in this country found out that they were free. And then you claim that, well, I didn't understand the significance of that. You picked that date on purpose. You intentionally were trying to rile up Black people, get us upset, and let these white supremacist folks that are some of your bigger supporters know that, listen, I'm in your corner with you. I have your back. You have my back. I have your back. And to see those people, ransack the U.S. Capitol, attempt to murder our lawmakers in Congress, and then to basically have this man not be held accountable by Republicans in the Senate. I hate to get into politics, but I tell people, listen, politics is what it is. People try to say, oh, you can't get political. Nonsense. Everything is political in this country. If we talk about, the gun rights, the First Amendment to the Constitution, that's political. We could talk about that, but we can't talk about racism and use politics, because it's very clear to all of us that we're paying attention that the rise in hate across the country, the rise in hate against the Muslim community since 9/11. But think about where did that 9/11 didn't create the hate of Muslims in this country, right? It was already there, particularly people that we think are from the Middle East, right? If you go back and you watch movies from the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, every time you see someone from the Middle East, they're portraying a terrorist, right? So you have this mindset already in your mind. You've already been indoctrinated into believing this. And 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, well, we knew that was going to happen. Think about the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995. The first news story said Islamic terrorists, right? And then all of a sudden we find out it was a couple white guys, and we refuse to call them terrorists, right? Mm-hmm. We refuse to call, Dylan Roof, who went into a church with a group of beautiful Black people, and sat there with them during Bible study, and then pulled out a gun and murdered 9 of these individuals. We won't call him a terrorist. We won't call this young kid, Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot and killed 2 people and injured another person, maimed this other person, literally. We won't call them a terrorist because we can't as a society, we can't find a way to call white people terrorists, even though a majority of the terrorism in this country has been domestic terrorism by white people. But we refuse to use that word. No, it can't be terrorists. Yeah, nonsense. We got to get that mindset out of our head because what's happened is since 9/11, there have been attacks on Middle Eastern people. There have been attacks on anyone who's a Muslim across the country. The hate has risen to a level that people don't even understand. The number of attacks, the number of people whose businesses have been damaged. I mean, all of the horrible things that have happened to people, and we still, all of these years later, over 20 years later, and people still have that same level of hatred for people who practice the Muslim faith. And we have to begin to teach our children to see the world differently, right? One of the good things about our kids is that they are more open-minded when they're young. Now, by the time they get to the teenage years, 14, 15, 16, their minds are pretty closed. That you can't indoctrinate them into thinking differently than they thought. But if we get to them young enough, and we began to teach true American history, and not just teach the history that's left out of the history books, not just teach them about the treatment of Native Americans, the treatment of Chinese who were excluded from immigrating to the country from 1882 until 1943, teaching them about the deportations of Mexican Americans, people born in the United States who were deported back to Mexico, a place they had never been before, in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. If we teach about these things at an early age, you begin to have children that begin to say, okay, well, thank you for sharing that with me. Now, the next step is to say, okay, so what do you think about those things? How do you as a child think about those things? Because we don't ask children for their opinions, right? As teachers, and I was a teacher for 8 years, we give them information and we say, okay, we're going to give you a quiz or test on this next week. Instead of asking, well, how do you feel about this? What's your thoughts on this? I tried to do this as a teacher to give my students an opportunity to give me some feedback, like, okay, let's have a conversation about these things. I want to hear your thoughts. And one of the things that I did with my students was when we talked about the civil rights movement, I didn't talk about Dr. King. I didn't talk about Rosa Parks. I didn't talk about Malcolm X, because I'm like, they hear about those individuals every Black History Month. They know everything about them already. Let's analyze the children of the civil rights movement. Let's look at those images of Birmingham and see those children being arrested. Let's see those children being attacked with the water hoses. Let's look at the images of the open housing marches in Milwaukee and not talk about Father Grappi and Vale Phillips. Let's talk about the children from the NAACP Youth Council who were marching and had bricks and bottles and bags of feces thrown at them. Let's include the children in the story so they can see themselves in the history and then they connect with it. And when it comes to white children, listen, they have to learn that the world that they live in right now is going to be very different than the world that they live in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 from now, 20 years from now. They estimate, the Census Bureau estimates about the year 2045, that white people will for the first time be less than 50% of the U.S. population. We already have seen, going back to, I think 2017 was the first year that a majority of the babies born in this country were non-white babies. Right? That's the world these children are going to live in. They're not going to live in the world that their parents and grandparents and great grandparents lived in. White people are only 60% of the population right now. And these children are going to live in a world where that number is going to continue to drop, not because of anything related to immigration. That's part of it. But mostly the reason that the demographics has changed is because white people aren't having as many children as they used to have. They're also the oldest people. They have the smallest percentage of women of childbearing age of any group in the country, right? The two groups that have the largest percentage of women of childbearing age are Asians and the Latinx community. So guess what? If a woman is of childbearing age, that means she's probably going to have some children, right? So you're going to continue to see those populations grow and grow and grow. And the world that these children live in will be a more diverse, more inclusive world, because guess what? People who have been marginalized because of their religious beliefs, because of their sexual orientation, all these different things, these people are tired of living with that. And they have advocated for being included. And now young people are in that space where they're getting that, right? They are living in that inclusive world much more so than older people. And I think if we continue to really educate young people across the board in every racial and ethnic group of an understanding that you live in the most diverse country on the planet Earth, the most inclusive country on the planet Earth, because people have advocated for inclusiveness, then the world can be a better place for you. It's hard to convince some older people of that, though. It's really,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, let's hope that this has been, definitely, particularly the last year and the previous, 4 years. Let's hope that those were really a learning opportunity for a lot of people, and to also see the ugliness of divisiveness and how important unity as a country is. Tell us a little bit about the organization that you're working with right now.
Yeah, so about 3.5 years ago, my good friend and colleague, Dr. Fran Kaplan, and I, who had been doing programming work with America's Black Holocaust Museum, we're part of the small group of volunteers that worked to reestablish the museum after it closed. And we worked, for a number of years to bring the museum back kind of out into the public. Fran and I did a lot of public programming. We brought people together to have conversations, dialogues about race and racism. I traveled around many places talking about these issues. And so about 3.5 years ago, we decided that we wanted to reach an audience outside of the Milwaukee region. We wanted to get into the suburban and exurban and rural communities more. And so we started our company, Nurturing Diversity Partners, with that aim of reaching these other parts, the whiter parts of Wisconsin. And eventually it led us to doing some work nationally as well. And so what we try to do is we try to use the historical lens to teach people the things they didn't learn in history class so that they can really understand how we got to where we are. Because this is what we try to do in this country. We try to fix things without knowing how they got broken in the first place, right? You can't do that. It doesn't work. We have to have an honest understanding of American history so that people understand, like, wow, now I understand why Black people are so far behind. Now I understand, because of redlining, racial restrictive covenants, I understand why Black people have such a low home ownership rate. I understand why the prison population is what it is, because of Black people being marginalized and having far more contact with the police. This is one of the things that I've shared with people in a program I do called the 2.2 Million, is one of the programs we do, is to talk about the history of mass incarceration. And one thing that people simply don't understand about it is, we think that the prison population was driven by the war on drugs. It really wasn't. A majority of people in state prisons are not in there for drug crimes. About 40% of people in federal prison are in there for drug crimes. But if you look at our federal prison system, right now, studies will show us that, and this is a surprise to people too, national studies show us that only about 17.8% of lifetime crack cocaine users were Black people. But the face of crack cocaine is always a Black face, right? It's always a Black face. 66% of lifetime crack cocaine users were white people. And the DEA will tell you that most people buy drugs from people who look just like themselves. So literally 2/3 of people who've ever used crack cocaine in their lives are white people. But when you look at who's in federal prison for crack cocaine, 66% of lifetime users were white, but only 4.2% of people in federal prison for crack cocaine are white. Black, 17.8% of lifetime users of crack. 88% of people in federal prison for crack cocaine are Black. And you know why? Selective enforcement. When Black people were selling crack and using crack, the police came in, locked us up, threw away the key. White people were out in the suburbs and rural communities using crack cocaine. Police weren't anywhere to be seen. They didn't enforce the laws there. And so that disparity is there, and we have to re-educate ourselves. I tell people, if you want to go on this journey of changing the country and bringing some unity back, and I always say the unity, if white people are not united, then that's a big problem. And that's what we're seeing now. Because listen, people of color, we've always had advocates and allies from the white community. We have more because of what happened to George Floyd, and that's wonderful. I wrote a piece last year, Janan, and the title of it was that, now that you're woke, are you going to get out of the bed and do something? Because it's wonderful for white people to say, I support the Black Lives Matter movement, and have the Black Lives Matter hats on and the signs in their yard and the T-shirts and all that. That's wonderful, but that's not enough. You have to do more, and you have to be courageous enough to understand that you're going to lose some friends and maybe even some family members, relationships, if you do this anti-racism work. Because it's not good enough to say that you support these things. You have to be an active anti-racist person as a white person. Then we make progress, because white people still control all of the institutions in the country. They're the ones that are doing the hiring and the firing. They are the ones that know when a person who's a Muslim comes in to apply for a job and they do really well in the interview and they end up not getting hired. The white people there are the ones who know that that person didn't get the job because they were Muslim. That
Mm-hmm.
person who didn't get the job, they don't know why they didn't get the job. But the white people in that office, they know that manager said, well, there's no way we're going to hire that person. These people are terrorists. We don't know that. As the victims of it, we don't hear it, but we know that that's part of our lived experience. So it's really incumbent upon white people to really step up to the plate and advocate for an honest America. We are living in a very dishonest America right now, unfortunately, and we need more honesty. We need people, and it's not about teaching your children to be racist. You don't have to teach your children. America will teach your children to be racist. American society, television, movies, all they're going to do a very good job of teaching your children to be little racist. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to contribute at all. You just let them live in America, and it's going to happen. Even if they live in other countries, they're going to learn because we transport our ideals, our movies, our television shows around the world, and people learn these negative things. So when it comes to unity, I always say this about unity: we have to get white people united, because if we still have this huge percentage of white people that continue to support racism, continue to support a system that they built to advantage themselves, why would you disassemble that system? I mean, that's the question I always ask. Like, people don't understand. You don't build a system to benefit yourself and then turn around and tear it down. That's the challenge we have. White people they're loving their privilege. They're loving their entitlement. And I joked once years ago at a program I did at Alverno College. I said, listen, white people, regardless of whether you want the privilege or not, you're going to get it. You don't have to say, man, can I get some of that white privilege? You don't have to ask for it. It's going to be given to you whether you want it or not. And you have to understand that when you get those privileges, you get those advantages, that means that somehow people of color are going to be disadvantaged. White people need to learn how to share the wealth. They need to learn how to share the resources, the jobs, all of those things with people of color, because at some point, a majority of the people in the country will not be white. And if you haven't created a system that is going to allow these young children of color to really do well educationally, you're going to have a very hard time competing as a nation with other nations, because you're going to continue to fall behind because you've miseducated young Black, young Latino, young Native American children for so long that when they become the majority of the young adults in our society in the not too distant future, America is going to be in a lot of trouble, and America's going to look at itself and say, "Wow, we should have done better by these people."
You're absolutely right. That's really profound, and I think that's so important, because not only is it the right thing to do, and is it the conscionable thing to do. Social justice is not something that you just talk about. It's something that it's an action. It has to take place that way. But I think you are so right in the fact that America loses. I mean, why would you allow half of your population to not to not succeed? It is really important. But we could talk with you forever, Reggie. You're just always wonderful to have on, and I just do want to thank you. I want to remind everyone that this is February. This is the second of our monthly virtual film series. We had to cancel our film festival last year, so we're doing this year virtual, but we did get slated for October for our film festival. So we will have our film festival at the end of October, I think the third week of October, at the Oriental Theater, and hopefully by then it will be an in-person film festival. So we're really looking forward to that. I want to actually recognize also two people that are our kind of like our IT people behind this whole system of doing our virtual films, Thea Lavin and Fatiha Tayyib. If you guys can just come in, say hello. Fatiha, you can, yeah. So these two are our brains, the technical brains behind getting the entire virtual film festival going. So thank you both very much. We cannot do it without you. And I want to just remind our audience that next month we will have another film, and we are offering these shows for free, but we do pay for each person. We do pay for each person, so we encourage you to, whatever level you want to donate. It just helps us offset our costs. But we find these films are important enough that we want to offer them, so that regardless of ability to pay, it's accessible to everyone. Reggie, what can I say, my friend? It's always great again to have you, and I'm sure we will be seeing you again, and hopefully after COVID we'll have some in-person event as well. And
Yeah,
Thea, thank you for handling this, and
yeah.
thank you to our audience for joining us this evening.
Well, I look forward to those in-person events, and the image behind me is Elmina Castle in Ghana, and that was the first slaving fortress built. It's called Elmina, which means the mine, and so they were literally using Black people in that way, and it's still there. People should Google Elmina Castle and learn why those guns were there. Those big cannons that you see.
Yeah.
Guess why the cannons were there? To protect whichever European nation owned that castle, protecting them from the other European nations who wanted to take it over and take over the enslaving of African people from that place. So a lot of stuff for us to learn. Thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be back in this space with you. You all are doing such fabulous work. I'm really just very gratified that you and I have gotten to know each other over the years, and look forward to many more years of collaboration. And really just thank you all. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone.
Yes, thank you.
It will be a cold one, but
yes,
it will be a good day.
Yes, it will. Thank you again. Thank you. And thank you to our audience. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks.